Number 7. Kamari Belmont. On May the 1st of 2015, Kamari Belmont broke into a Chicago home with the intention of robbing it. When the homeowner put up a fight, Belmont shot him in the leg before fleeing the scene, only to rob yet another person just a few hours later that same day. When a bystander flagged down a police car that happened to be passing by, Belmont was arrested and charged with 2 robberies and attempted murder. About 3 weeks later, the man he'd shot in the leg died, and prosecutors tried to elevate the charge to murder. However, a paperwork loophole would lead to Belmont becoming a free man. It took the district attorney's office too long to raise the charges, and due to the state's speedy trial statute, the charge had to be dropped. The only charges that remained were the 2 robberies, out of which a friend of Belmont's bailed him with $10,000. Just minutes after walking out of jail, Belmont was gunned down and killed by a rival gang who drove by in an SUV in what was described as a well-planned hit. Number 6. Richard Rosario. On June the 19th of 1996, 17-year-old Jorge Collazo was shot and killed as he was walking in the Bronx with his friend Michael Sanchez. Collazo was reported to have been shot by a Hispanic man who'd gotten out of a car and briefly argued with him before delivering the fatal shot and speeding off in his car. Evidence would later suggest that the argument was related to drug activity, since a handgun and illegal substances were found on Collazo. When conducting their investigation, the authorities asked Sanchez and other witnesses if they'd seen anyone around when the crime took place, and asked them to take a look at photographs of people who'd been arrested at that precinct. Richard Rosario's photograph was among the many they sifted through, since earlier in his life he'd been arrested for robbery and possession of stolen property. When Sanchez came across Rosario's photo, he identified him as the attacker. Rosario was subsequently charged with second-degree murder and went to trial. There was strong evidence to suggest that he wasn't linked to the shooting. It included witness testimony that he wasn't even in New York when it had taken place, but rather in Florida for the birth of his son. However, the prosecution discredited the witnesses as friends of Rosario's. On November the 23rd of 1998, Rosario was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The fight for proving his innocence didn't stop, as Rosario appealed multiple times, yet despite having 7 more witnesses testifying to his presence in Florida at the time of the murder, 3 of which were given a polygraph test and passed, none of the appeals was successful. Further investigation found that the police and prosecution hid evidence which revealed that, in Sanchez's original statement, he said that he'd never even seen the gunman. In fact, he never even picked Rosario out of a lineup, and that he'd been subtly guided into selecting him as the culprit by the police. It wasn't until March the 23rd of 2016 that Rosario was finally cleared of all charges and released from prison. Number 5. Albert Flick. Kimberly Dobbie, a 48-year-old mother from Maine, was fatally stabbed 11 times in broad daylight outside of a laundromat on July the 15th of 2018. The attacker was 77-year-old Albert Flick, an ex-convict who'd become obsessed with Dobbie and stalked her. He allegedly followed the woman around town, but she rejected any type of relationship with him, leading to the violent attack which took place right in front of her children. Flick was convicted of murder and will spend the rest of his life behind bars. This wasn't his first time in jail for murder, as in 1979 he was convicted for the same crime. He fatally stabbed his wife 14 times, resulting in a 25-year jail sentence. Flick was released in 2004 but would go on to commit more violent crimes. In 2010, he was convicted of assaulting 2 women, and in spite of the prosecutor asking for 9 years in jail, the judge ultimately only sentenced him to 4 years, arguing that he would be too old to commit any more violent acts. It would prove to be a tragically misguided assessment. When he was released in 2014, Flick moved to Lewiston, Maine, where his infatuation with Dobbie began, ultimately concluding with her violent killing. Number 4. Johnny Frank Garrett. On Halloween night, 1981, Sister Tadia Benz, a 76-year-old nun, was abused and strangled to death at her convent in Texas. At the young age of 17, Johnny Frank Garrett was accused and convicted of the crime. He was put on death row, scheduled to be executed on January the 6th of 1992, but was given temporary reprieve by a Texan governor after Pope John Paul II asked for leniency on his behalf. Shortly thereafter, a hearing was held to determine whether Garrett's sentence should be reduced to life in prison or if he'd be executed. Ultimately, the death sentence was upheld by a 17-1 vote, and he was executed by lethal injection on February the 11th of 1992 at the age of 28. However, there'd always been shadows of doubt as to whether he was truly guilty. Garrett had insisted until the very end that he was innocent. Even after the execution, Texas attorney Jesse Quackenbush continued to investigate, insisting that Garrett had been a victim of poor defense attorneys and ruthless prosecutors. A break in the case wouldn't arrive until March of 2004. The cold case of another nun, 77-year-old Nani Bryson, who was killed in a chillingly similar manner just 4 months before Benz, resurfaced. New DNA evidence identified a man named Leoncio Rueda as Bryson's abuser and murderer. Police and prosecutors agreed that both deaths were so similar that they'd likely been committed by the same person. Rueda eventually confessed to Bryson's murder but didn't receive the death penalty. That would have involved an extended trial, which would have brought attention to Benz's case again and the unjust execution of Garrett. The state of Texas wasn't keen on publicly revealing that its legal system had potentially failed him. Number 3. Emma Pressler. On August the 6th of 2021, 19-year-old Texas teen Emma Pressler fled the scene of the crime after breaking into a home and setting a young couple on fire. The victims were 33-year-old Devin Graham and his girlfriend, Carissa Lindros, aged 26. They were able to escape the home, which was subsequently engulfed by flames as well, and were taken to the hospital with severe burns. A motive for the attack has yet to have been released, but one of Lindros's relatives did tell a media outlet that Pressler knew her. A few days after the incident, Graham died from his injuries. Lindros suffered severe burns to 70% of her body, but was expected to make a full recovery. Pressler was charged with murder while on the run from the police. She was found and arrested later in the month, on August the 26th. The teenager was charged with the murder of Devin Graham, but it wasn't in fact her first run-in with the law. Less than a year prior, in September of 2020, Pressler was charged with murder in the shooting of 20-year-old Sierra Rod, a woman suffering from cerebral palsy. Rod was in her bed when she was shot through her bedroom window. Pressler was allegedly at the scene with her then-boyfriend and 3 other people when they surrounded the house and fired 40 to 60 rounds into it. Police said that the group had meant to harm Rod's younger brother, who had some feud with them, with the young woman being caught in the crossfire. Pressler was said to have acted as the getaway driver, but a judge later determined that the evidence wasn't strong enough to link her to the crime and dropped the murder charge for that case. Number 2. Courtney Hackney. 57-year-old Holly Barnett was beaten to death with a baseball bat in her Missouri home on May the 16th of 2017. The attacker was 32-year-old Courtney Hackney, reported as Barnett's niece, to whom she'd opened her home up in light of her transient status. Another family member living with Barnett came home and witnessed the horrific scene. As she tried to run out of the house, Hackney attempted to drag her back in, but fortunately, she was able to escape and call the police for help. Officers arrived at the scene and shortly thereafter found Hackney hiding in a nearby cemetery. She was charged with second-degree murder, but her 2018 court proceedings resulted in a mistrial when the jury couldn't come to a unanimous decision. A second trial set for 2019 was attempted, but due to several scheduling conflicts with the witnesses, they dismissed the case and planned to refile. However, because of double jeopardy, a rule in place that prevents a person from being tried twice for the same crime, prosecutors had no choice but to drop all charges. Due to this legal technicality, Hackney walked away with no consequences. Number 1. Clemente Aguirre Harquin. On June the 17th of 2004, the bodies of 47-year-old Cheryl Williams and her mother, 68-year-old Carol Barris, were found in their Florida trailer home. Williams was stabbed 129 times and bled to death, with a stab wound to her left lung believed to have been the fatal blow. Barris suffered 2 stab wounds, one in the back and one in the left ventricle. The third resident of the home, Williams's daughter, Samantha, was out that night and reportedly sleeping at her boyfriend's house. The main suspect in the double homicide was their neighbor with whom they'd spend time and socially drink, a 24-year-old Honduran immigrant named Clemente Aguirre Harquin. After living through extreme levels of violence and personally witnessing at least 3 murders in his home country, Aguirre Harquin desperately fled to and illegally entered the United States, hoping for a safe haven. Early in the morning on June the 17th, he had knocked on his neighbor's door and was shocked to find Cheryl's body blocking it. He pushed his way inside and fruitlessly checked for a pulse. He also discovered Barrios's body, slumped over in her wheelchair. Being an illegal immigrant, he feared that if he called the police, they would never believe that he was innocent. As Aguirre Harquin discovered the horrific crime scene, Samantha was waking up at her boyfriend's house. She told him she had a strange feeling about her mother and asked him to go and check on her and to pick up some work clothes. Upon reaching the residence, he discovered the double murder and immediately called the police. Williams gave Aguirre Harquin's name to the police, saying that he must have done it. Aguirre Harquin explained to the police that he had discovered them earlier that same morning and tried to help, which is why he had blood on his clothes but was afraid to call the police because of his immigration status. He was arrested and charged with double homicide and burglary. He was then put on death row. However, the non-profit organization Innocence Project believed he wasn't guilty and worked tirelessly to exonerate him. After collecting DNA samples and working with blood splatter experts, they found that Samantha's blood was mixed in with her mother's, suggesting that she was present at the scene and highlighting her as a suspect. Her boyfriend also shared that he'd seen her sneak out of the window on the night of the attack, before sneaking back in later. In the months following the crime, Samantha even admitted to multiple people that she had killed her mother and grandmother, saying that she hated them and that the demons made her do it. Aguirre Harquin was finally exonerated after being sentenced to death and spending 14 years in jail. Thanks for watching. Would you rather spend life in jail for a crime you committed or be on the run forever for a crime you didn't commit? Let us know in the comments section below.